Hello and welcome to the next episode of our webinar series hosted by Vic No-TIll, focusing on relevant issues around soil carbon through a closer look at strategies to increase soil organic matter. This project is supported by the Wimmera CMA through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare program. We'd like to thank them very much for their support. For those that missed last week's webinar with David, it was a really good session. It's up on the YouTube channel now, so you can go and view it again. So today we're back with Graeme. Graeme's one of Australia's leading holistic land management and training consultants, who has over 25 years of planned grazing experience and holistic management training. This webinar is the fourth webinar of his six-part series. So the previous three are up on YouTube. If you haven't caught up with them, go and check them out. So, and this one is being recorded, so you'll be able to see it on YouTube as well. So without further ado, welcome, Graeme.
Great. Thanks, Dan. I'll just share my screen and get into it. Have you hit record, Dan? You've already done it, have you?
It is recording, yep.
Oh, fantastic. I'm used to doing all that stuff myself. So, yeah, sorry about that. So, welcome, everyone, to another week of the webinars. I'm currently up in Bombala in that southeast New South Wales, just running a workshop on grazing and talking to people about weed problems and stuff. And I was going to include a bit of that today. So just to sort of think through how we get weed control in grazing in pastures via strong, healthy perennial grasslands. I haven't had a chance to update the latest ABARES figures, but yeah, I'm really interested in doing it, and I'll try and do it before I send out the slides. But yeah, they're still quoting that $81 billion. So I'll be interested to see what's happening with the green here. So what do farmers keep along this green line? So the problem I see is that the declining terms of trade due to increasing cost of inputs, which would be no surprise to anyone listening. I started quoting back out here that as this continues to rise, then prices must go up to keep this line flat. So this is an estimate by ABARES, and I just can't see it coming to fruition. But hopefully, I'm proven wrong, and that we have a 100% increase from here to here in farm net value, so money to farmers. And debt continues to kick away. So I'm saying we need to redesign out of this. We need to lower risk. We need to lower costs. We need to lower inputs. But how do we do that while maintaining profit, not production? We're hardwired to chase production, and we've got to chase profit. We've got to stop thinking about how much we can push this blue line up and maybe even flatten the blue line, but massively increase the green lines. How much money stays with the farmer? There's always been a transfer of value from farms to agribusiness and feedlots and stuff. So we need to start sort of redesigning out of that. And that's just a design problem. So I still would like to keep talking about this. It's about minimizing losses rather than maximizing production. It was very interesting. There was a couple of people there that hadn't heard me talk yesterday, and all they said was, will we be able to increase stocking rate? So very much a grazing area around Bombala. And they just wanted to increase stocking rate. And I said, you don't want to do that. You want to increase, as I've said many times, you want to increase profit, focus on profit, and it may mean backing off. So most farms are overstocked and overcropping. So the grazing farms generally, there's an optimum stocking rate for profit, and they're over the optimum. You can reduce their stocking rate and they actually increase in profit. So I keep getting people, it's very hard to calculate this. It's sort of high complexity depending on seasons and prices and the whole thing. So all I do is get people to take out maybe 10% of their stock. And if their profit goes up, which it usually does, then I say take another 10%. And if it goes up again, that's great. If they take another 10% and it goes down, I go, we'll put that 10% back. But it's about this forever searching for that optimum profit point. And I also made a comment about overcropping. So a lot of people are cropping areas that should be grazing areas. So eliminate all those areas that are high risk country on your place. So the areas that either suffer frosts or are too sandy and light and suffer too high a spring rainfall risk. So you need to be thinking about this. How do I take risk out of it? Most of the advice you get does not worry about your risk. They're trying to just push production. So, and having worked at Hamilton DPI, I know all about that. So, so the risks in agriculture, debt. So we need to get debt under control, rainfall risk and market price risk in that order. Debt's the highest because it compounds down. Seasonal, rainfall and floods and frosts, etc. There's the next biggest risk, and then market price. You cannot decrease your rain or seasonal risk if you have more enterprises that also rely on rainfall. So I work with a lot of people that they're going to diversify and don't have all their eggs in one basket, but then the next basket that they pick has actually got the same rainfall risk. So I go, that hasn't changed your risk to me. That's still got all the eggs in one basket. So shifting, if you're a grazing enterprise and shifting to cropping, both rainfall risk, if anything, you've increased your risk by shifting to a cropping problem. So what is that balance of on those farms of the grazing? And it's got to be profitable grazing, not that you're pumping all the money into the pastures and the animals and feed, that profitable grazing and the cropping to sort of get that balance. So at the moment, a lot of the research that you see shows that the grazing is too low to cover your costs and stuff. And we're finding if you go to low cost, low risk landscape function grazing, that you can actually shift away from that. I think we need to look at sort of different ways of thinking about debt. I just did some scribbles. So how do we stop ever increasing debt? You can't take advice from your accountant. This isn't about minimizing tax. If the accountant says here, increase your debt so that you don't pay as much tax, you've got to tell him, no, that's bad thinking, because debt's the highest risk I have in my business and I want to decrease debt. So don't take business advice from an accountant. Seasonal risk, you've got to start sort of having heads you win, tails you win, and sort of other enterprises not linked to rainfall. And you've got to be a low-cost producer if you're selling into the commodity market, so that your costs are below the market price. This is the target that I'm saying we're heading towards, so that money and people are nested in regenerating land. So it's increasing in landscape function and biodiversity. I found that increasing is a better word than sort of giving people an end target, which seems to be a bit demotivating. So I just say you must increase your landscape function each day. So everything you do, what's going to increase landscape function? What's going to lower your risk and increase your profits? And how can you increase well-being scores? It's not easy. It's hard doing one of those things, but you've got to combine all three to make a family business or a farm business that's enjoyable and profitable and increasing landscape function. So that's sort of my whole thing, that each day just increase those things, and after a couple of years you'll have more landscape function and it'll be going better. So I haven't got the chat up, but yeah, if you wanted to stick anything in, any comments, any questions, any arguments, really like arguing. So what is landscape function? I'll just quickly go through this. I know we've done it before, but it's essential. It's the science of reading the land, and it's about reading the soil surface. As farmers, we manage the soil surface to increase soil health. So it's about that focus. So I'm not a big one about looking in the soil. I find that the soil's a lagging indicator of what you're doing on the soil surface. Just as we were getting ready, we were talking about some practices that lower landscape health because they're too much ploughing, too much removal of ground cover, etc. So we need to manage the soil surface. And what do we look at on the soil surface? Well, if you don't want the land to erode, then you look at cover. Soil cover and litter cover. And there's no way of getting around that. So how do you keep the soil covered for 100% of the time is really the aspirational goal for what we're doing. With grazing, it's pretty easy. With cropping, it's much harder to do. And there's a few, as I always quote sort of my friend Gabe Brown, that can do this. So if you want stability, not erosion, then you've got to have it covered with either annual plants or litter on the soil surface between those annual plants. If you want it to be infiltrating water, then perennial grasses are sort of incredibly important in a grazing system. I keep thinking we've lost that about perennial grasses, where people think it's almost like the background music to agriculture. Perennial grasses, they have a very poor, low profile. It's like some people I talk to, I think they just think it's green paint on the land or whatever. So this basal cover of perennial grasses, how much of each hectare, what percentage of each hectare is covered with mature perennial grass bases? And those bases have got to be more than 2 centimetres by 2 centimetres to qualify as mature. So this is a hard one for people, but that's the target that they found when they did this work at CSIRO, that showed that if they're more than 4 square centimetres or 4 or more, that they were going to have a high likelihood of being there into the future. Seedlings can disappear, young plants can disappear, mature grasses are going to stay there, and they provide like a funnel, an entry point for water into the soil. So we're managing that interface between the atmosphere and the soil, and it's all about that level and what we're working on there. David Tongway wouldn't let me use a hammer. Wouldn't let me use a shovel. I had to use a paint scraper because he said, otherwise you're thinking too deep. It's about managing that layer there. And some of those things sort of are really important. Again, litter cover, break up the drops, stop the overland flow. And that's what the surface roughness is as well for water infiltration. So you've got this textured soil surface that's allowing the water to slow down and infiltrate into the soil. The surface roughness that you need, I think, as a minimum is about over 1 metre. The highest point is about 8 millimetres higher than the lowest point. So it can't be smooth. In southwest Victoria, if we couldn't drive the ute over the paddocks at 80 k's, people would plough it up, smooth it up and re-sow it. It's probably the worst thing you could do for landscape function and soil health, but it was so they could drive they didn't like the rough surface. And ideally that roughness is coming from those perennial grass bases, so not necessarily pugging and or ploughing. So you're getting that there. And then for nutrient cycling, which is the really big one and what we spend a lot of money on, is those relationships. Again, how much of each hectare is covered by the basis of perennial grasses. Most pastures that I go to throughout sort of Australia and US and South America and Asia and stuff have got less than 10% covered by perennial grasses. When we're doing a good job with managing you're over 30%. So it's quite a lot. It gets very dense. A lot of pastures will look good as you're driving past. You've got to stop, look down and start doing some of this monitoring so that you know how much it is. So how much is covered. Then this is really crucial because this is the link between all agriculture, is the decomposition of the litter between the plants. So I've probably got the slide up further, but it is the link between soils getting better and not. So at the same surface roughness, and this is really broad, you get about 50% of your nutrient cycling from the perennial grasses and about 50% of your nutrient cycling from that decomposing litter. So what you're doing is you're growing that litter in situ and then pushing it onto the soil surface so it can be decomposed and used into the soil. I've got some photos up there further. So that's the really key one that you see. So if you go into people's farms, the thing that's missing is decomposing litter. And that's what we're always working to turn around. So, and there's all the links. And that's sort of the foundation. There's more to this. There's texture and springiness and all the other things as well. But they're the main ones that we manage. And to get the land to be stable, infiltrate water and cycle nutrients. So if you want to increase soil carbon, there's a direct correlation between this nutrient cycling index and soil carbon. So that work's been done. I'm happy to send any of that, but you can find it on the link on the bottom here. So David Tongway's uploaded that so that you can get all the LFA procedures. And there's a direct correlation between nutrient cycling and soil carbon. If you want to increase soil carbon, you need to increase nutrient cycling, which means that's about surface roughness, decomposition of the litter. If you're in a cropping situation, in a grazing situation, then the basal cover of perennial grass kicks in. So, and we know that there's an order to things, that annual litter's not as good as annual grasses, which is not as good as perennial grass litter, which is not as good as perennial grass. And Susan Orgel from New South Wales DPI did that work. So, so there's this is the science. When people are talking about, the land and management and all the different versions and styles and schools of thought, this is the science that they should be working to. So makes me a bit cranky at times. So decomposing litter is the common link. This is moderate decomposition of the litter. This is Gabe's soil with decomposing. So I can see there's slight decomposition. He's showing the worms, but I see the worms as a lagging indicator of creating the decomposing litter. So I measure that, and then if you want to confirm, you can do that. So when you increase the nutrient cycling index, you'll increase phosphorus availability, nitrogen storage in the soil, all those other things we need to be low cost, low risk producers. And that's slight decomposition of the litter on my hand there. Just quickly, the life cycle of a grass. It's ready to be grazed when it looks like an ungrazed plant and contains fresh yellow litter. The animals are severe grazers, and we must graze severely because otherwise you lose the better perennial grasses, as I've said previously. The plant then mobilizes its root reserves. These plants are exquisitely designed to be grazed severely. Not grazing them severely creates so many other problems. You lose the better perennials. You don't get the decomposition of the litter as high. There's a whole heap of other things. So you get lower stability, lower water infiltration, lower nutrient cycling by doing leaf-driven recovery versus root-driven recovery. If you graze these grasses at this stage, you'll overgraze them. So grazing at that stage is the definition of overgrazing. because you're eating leaf that's growing, actively growing from root reserves. So eating the plant down is just utilization. Eating the plant after it's sprung up is actually overgrazing. So, do you know, one of the confusing things that's out there is about this second bite stuff. It's not the second bite going down the plant. It's the second bite when the plant has reshot and used its root reserves. Because if you keep doing that, you weaken the plant and eventually you weaken the roots. And then once you've weakened the roots, you'll start to get forbs and annual plants back in, annual grasses and stuff back into the mix. And then eventually you'll kill the perennials. So I'll talk about Margaret River in a moment, but I was over there too. When was that? Last week? Can't remember where I am. Sorry, I was going to make some other point. No, I've forgotten. So this is also toxic to the animals, and it'll cause scours or diarrhea, and also scours in the calves and the lambs. If you eat too much of this, the dung scores will go down, and you'll start to your dung scores of the animals go down. They get dirty rumps and squirty, and then that goes through the milk into the lambs or the calves, and you then get scours in the calves or lambs. So this is a really big problem, trying to eat the grass when it's too young or too fresh. I have a real problem with people saying that, the grass is too watery. So they go, and I go, well, what do you mean the grass is too watery? Oh, well, that's why they've got diarrhea, because there's too much water in the grass. And so then they're like, depending what mood I'm in, I'll usually go for, do you drink water with a meal? Does it cause diarrhea? It's just ridiculous. It's actually that the grass is too high in non-protein nitrogen and causes the scours. So, and a lot of worm problems are actually driven by scouring the lining off the guts, and then that provides the entry conditions for the worms. So, there's a whole confusion over cause and effect as well. So the plants become energy positive and start replacing their roots. Now, if you graze that, you wouldn't kill that plant, but you wouldn't increase landscape function. And then that's that next stage. So, the dairy farmers, we know really well that they're always trying to not waste any litter because it's wasted. So they're trying to do that 3-leaf ryegrass grazing. And if they don't do the litter, now they've got to be responsible for stability, water infiltration and nutrient cycling, and not letting the plants go through and increase landscape function, then increases their costs as well as their rainfall risk, because the plants are as resilient and stable. So it's, happy to talk about more of that if that's of interest. So perennial grass is ready to be grazed, or even your annual grasses. It's when they contain fresh yellow litter. So usually the thing that's missing in most grazing situation is litter covering the soil surface. So when it looks like an ungrazed plant contains fresh yellow litter, which is about that leaf emergence. Just quickly, use safe to fail trials. I think it's really important to do safe to fail trials. I can't see people untangling this. You've actually got to do the trial to take action to work out what's worthwhile doing and what's not. And I was using that marker buoy in the channel from Dave Snowden as a way of explaining that. Some you want to steer towards, some you want to steer away from. The develop convenient infrastructure. Don't keep subdividing paddocks. So you've got to go to some other way, because you never get enough paddocks by subdividing them. So I was just thinking last night that, Gabe does his subdivision strips, so flexible strip fencing and bat latches and stuff, that he can then also easily roll up, so he can do cropping when he needs to. And then the other big one is the right animal phenotypes. The majority of animals that you can buy are actually not the right type of animal to thrive under this management. And I'm happy to talk about that more. I just wanted to try and clarify a few things. I'm getting, if I say, oh, you can regenerate with the animals, everyone said, oh, is it from the fertilizer, the dung and urine? It's really the recovery, stock density and utilization. We've got a lot of evidence sort of that there's areas that regenerate and they haven't been dunged and urinated on. You can watch these in the safe to fail trials and stuff like that. So it's actually the recovery to grow the plant material, get the deep roots of the perennials or the grasses that you've got in there, then grow litter, put it on the ground, the stock density pushes it onto the soil surface so it can start to compost, and utilization, you've got to clear the throats of the grasses so that they actually are refreshed and stimulate the crowns. They take longer to recover, but it's lower cost, lower risk, lower drought risk, all those other things that keep money in the business. Sorry, I needed a gap between these. And just the impacts on soil health. So landscape function trumps plant diversity. So everyone, I think, has got a lot of the advisors are just diversity this, diversity that. And I'm pretty sure that landscape function trumps diversity. So that's not very popular. Perenniality, this is what this is saying, is that perenniality is more important than diversity. And, I'm working with people and that'll actually take a healthy perennial pasture, spray it out to put in a cover crop, a diverse cover crop, or as Colt, coined the term, a multi-species cover crop. And that is a decline in the environment. That is a decrease in land health, in environmental health. It's the wrong direction. A shift from perenniality to annuals is a decline in the environment. So we need to be really aware that there's got to be something else. So I see the cover crops, the biological primers, the multi-species cover crop, their function is in where you're cash cropping, not for grazing. And there's sort of confusion over that. Gabe said to me that he cannot make enough money out of multi-species cover crops to justify doing them if he's not also cash cropping. And as people that have studied any of his work would know, he makes a fair bit of money out of his meat and his direct sales and stuff. So so I'm just trying to sort of highlight that I think we get that flip around the wrong way. I was having a meal and club in New South Wales with Colin Syce after some training, and I just said to him, I think landscape function is more important than diversity, and he thought I'd got it wrong. And then I said, you regenerated your soils and landscape with red grass and sheep. So basically one perennial, there was a few more, but it was a foundation of red grass that's now moved on. And I regenerated with cows and phalaris down at Branksholme. There was no great diversity in there. But that provides that foundation that then you build the diversity on top of that once you've got that landscape function. So I think we sort of need to be really clear that in a grazing situation, we need to head to landscape function. So I was just going to use this as sort of weeds in pastures. So I'm getting lots of questions about weeds in pastures, and I'll go pretty quick. But basically, I've had to go back and talk about C3 and C4 plants. Summer growers and winter growers, like cropping, you guys know and understand the difference and soil temperature requirements and different photosynthetic pathways. So there's a lot of people don't. These are some of Colin's stiper slides that I've just clipped in. So a C3 plant's a winter grower, requires more water, but grows at lower temperature, higher quality feed, usually less volume. So, some of the species, wallaby grass, weeping grass, wheatgrass, plains grass, and spear grass. So, not some of the favourites down there. It's usually what's left when people are set stocking or overgrazing, that they'll get more and more of those lower successional spear grasses. Introduced species for, you guys know, Phalaris ryegrass, wheat, oat, barley. So, just some pictures here of weeping grass, microlina, that's at Cole's Place, wallaby grass, wheat grass, some of these stipe are spear grass, and that's wallaby grass, or that's why they call it white top. So C4s, they were Australia's dominant grassland species. They were all through right to the coast in southern Victoria. So, and they still grow. We've done trials with the trialing the African subtropicals and stuff right to the coast at Bairnsdale. They were Australia's dominant, mostly summer growers, more tolerant of heat. So I have to do this, I found, otherwise people don't get that whole idea of this. So windmill grass, which grows in your area really easily, Themida, this is a better grass, this Paspalidium, and Bothria chloa is a good sort of solid base. These are some of those African grasses, Premier digit green paddock, and Paspalum, which was brought in for dairying, and corn millet and sorghum. So nothing you guys don't know. Different growth periods, so the cool seasons and the warm seasons. The reason I had to go to this is that if you've got a low successional perennial grass weed, such as African lovegrass or serrated tussock or Chilean needlegrass, you've got to find out, is it a C3 or C4? Is it a cool or a warm season? So you know what's going to compete with it. And I'll try and explain that as I go. But basically, you've got to have that competition when it's growing. When in early April, I drove from Coniva up to Gunnedah, and this is what I saw along the road. This is from memory between Carnargo and Jerilderie, along that sort of road. I was heading to Narrandera for the day, so I went from Coniva to Narrandera. And these are two strips of African lovegrass. And these strips went nearly all the way to Gunnedah. Sometimes they were a bit broken and stuff like that, but you could find evidence of this. So, we need to be thinking about what's the evidence in the environment that can help us sort of solve this problem of African lovegrass. I'm putting this in because there is no way you can try and stop it seeding, and it's not the focus. The management of the roadsides is providing enough seed bank to last us till the end of time. So I hope that wasn't too dramatic, but this is sort of pretty healthy roadside, and the lovegrass isn't going into it. I stopped in a few places and walked in and had a look, but where they're mowing, and frequently mowing along here, they're weakening this competition so that the lovegrass gets to take hold. I find that really stark. And I get people to try and think about where could the weed be, but it's not. And it could be in here because it's got a seed source, but it's not. So why is that? It's because I'm arguing that it's got C4 grass competition up in that area. African lovegrass is out of AgVic. Flowers sort of, from November to April, seeding sort of Feb, March, April, germinating into blocks, which makes it really tricky. Most C4s don't germinate here. They'll germinate as the soil temperatures are rising. It's dormant in the middle of winter. You can, this is the recommended times to spray it. So I think that'll only get wider. And this is when it's actively growing. So from September through to there, and in a lot of areas, it's actually actively growing in some others. And I've got some photos, it looks like it's going to get through here. So in certain soils and types. So this is at Margaret River. I was working on one of the wineries there. So this is just a shot of one of their areas around their vineyards. African lovegrass, I didn't pull it apart. I should have pulled it apart to show that there's very there's no ground cover here. All the litter's up in the air, bare soil and capped with a cryptogam or a moss and lichen layer on the soil. So not going very well at all. There's plenty of litter in the system, but it's just not being managed and pushed down onto the soil. And then this is this thing about looking for where could it be, but it's not. So over here where this kikuyu is and this kikuyu here, it's not. So it's looking for those things and trying to solve, why isn't it on that roadside when it could be? Why isn't it in those sheep yards up the back of the place that are only used once a year? It's looking for that and looking for areas that it's not, rather than looking for areas that it is what helps me solve what's going on. So just another shot of it growing through here. And then where you had this big patch of kikuyu, which was up in the background, there was only 1 or 2 plants that could germinate and establish with that competition from the C4 grasses. So we need to be thinking about, how do I get something strong and vigorous and palatable that will outcompete these weeds? So weed control is about growing something to outcompete it over the long term in a grazing situation, because the current method isn't working. They were talking yesterday that task force, that it could be quite a long-term thing before they can get it back going again, just because that plant that was making it in China has lost its registration. So so that could be a really big issue, because what are you going to do? So cropping it's not such a problem. Grazing when it's moving in is a really big issue, and I'm recommending, even though I don't typically, I'm recommending that people keep control of it by spot spraying. So, and this was just what it looked like. It was all up right through the back, right up through that area. This area is occasionally grazed, but it's a good example of kikuyu. So this next slide, next little video needs a little bit of explanation. This is from Peter Reynolds that I work closely with. And what's happened here was that the animals pugged up an area and really gave it a hammering. But he's excited about it because it's giving him some information on how heavy he needs to graze areas that have got lovegrass. He sort of inherited a lot of lovegrass, and it's getting it's sort of we're starting to shift it back away from lovegrass, but it's very hard work. And that's why I'd be saying, if you can, sort of continue all your weed control and do the spot spraying and stuff.
Wow, looks like belting the lovegrass shifted it. Certainly a shift. Back fencing, it's changed everything.
And glad he can go for game changer. So for most people, they'd look at that and think of it as a disaster. What we're looking at is what information can you get from that, that over trampling and pugging and stuff. So there was kangaroo grass there. We know that up on this hill that's all kangaroo grass, there's very little lovegrass. It's only like on little ridges where they occasionally camp when we're moving them through, or gateways or something like that, that there's lovegrass. The rest of the kangaroo grass on that hill, there's very little lovegrass. So there's obviously strong competition from those healthy C4 grasses that sort of is actually able to reduce the rate of spread or stop the spread of lovegrass. but it's a lot of work. So most of the areas in sort of further to the coast than, sort of around Coniver and the west, the Wimmera Mallee and stuff, they grow C4 summer grasses really readily in that area. Down south, you get out competed with, sort of the cocksfoot and phalaris and stuff, and same in Tassie. So you need summer grass competition to control the summer grass. So, and the opposite's the same. So for a winter grass, a weedy perennial winter grass, you actually need really strong winter grass competition. So in Tasmania, I won't get up there and do that. But yeah, so it's about looking for that evidence. What is it that's telling you, that won't be able to get the residual herbicides? Roundup doesn't seem to slow it down very much. Glyphosate doesn't slow it down very much. So what are you going to do? So I was thinking, as I was thinking about this was from Stephen Hobbs at Coniver in his Safe to Fail trial area. I think with that amount of landscape function and ground cover, that area won't be able to support those lower successional perennials. The lower successional perennial grass weeds like Chilean and Serrate, tussock and African lovegrass are tricky because they're not far away from the management that we need to increase landscape function. So if we go from bare ground, just thinking about succession, go from bare ground, usually can go through moss and lichens, then to some annual plants, annual grasses, some thistles, to some lower coarse perennial grasses, spear grasses, and those weedy ones, up to the better, more palatable perennial grasses, and and curly windmill that grows readily in your area. That you can actually you can start to get a picture that you sort of it's easy to graze out and outcompete with grasses, capeweed and thistles and those sort of plants. They're very easy. As soon as you get any competition in that environment, it actually they fall out really quickly. One of the things is we're trying to target the plant. If you don't want to spend a lot of money or a lot of energy, you've got to target the plant at the weak link in its life cycle. I'll just go back. Just go back to this one. The weak link in most weeds is at germination and then establishment. So I keep thinking that one of the reasons lovegrass is so good is because, such a problem, not so good, is because of this range of germination. And what we need to be thinking about is, how do I create the conditions when it germinates and is trying to establish that don't favour it? So if you've got a lot of ground cover and decomposing litter, you've got, so you're getting this seed germinating. I came into a lot of the grazing and stuff through just trying to control thistles. I thought there must be a way of doing it without herbicide. I'd sprayed MCPA a fair bit at the rosette stage, and just if anything, it was just waiting for the next year to grow again. So as those little seeds germinate, what are they going to get enough light and moisture is one inhibiting thing. If there's root competition, perennial grass especially, root competition, then the roots of the perennial grasses, even when they're dormant, they're still controlling the nutrients, they're still cycling nitrogen, they're still using moisture, just even when they're idling and they're dormant. So you need to know that if you've got that competition below ground, that's what you're focusing on. Have I got good, strong competition below ground with big root zones so that then the nutrients aren't available? And if I think of thistles, if some do get through the litter and through the competition and they germinate and establish, if you've got the land covered in decomposing litter, they'll get fungal attack as they put their rosette down. They actually want bare ground to put their rosettes down on. If you're putting them down on high decomposing litter, then they won't get the right conditions that they like to go through, and you'll lose another percentage. You'll control another percentage of them. So it's this multi-stage thing that works if you increase landscape function for these type of plants. But you've got to have high landscape function, and you've got to have competition from those species at those different times. This is a bit further east, and and that's that decomposing litter, and it's starting to decompose into the soil, and you're getting all those root zones, and it's like pulling Velcro out. It's unlikely that you're going to get a big problem with African lovegrass in these conditions. It actually just sort of is so competitive. The perennial grasses, so even that when they're dormant, like to get an annual to grow in them is really difficult. I say they hate annuals, the perennial grasses. They want to control the game. They want to control the ball. And that's what, so when, Cole's doing his pasture cropping, he's forever trying to reduce the competition of the perennial grasses. So that's why he deliberately overgrazes the perennial grasses. He waits until they're frosted. He uses a desiccant herbicide. He uses knife points. He uses, a sort of a small amount of nitrogen fertilizer. And that's all about trying to, I think of it as trying to get the ball back off the perennial grasses so that he can put in his multi-species covers. So I just, that's the thinking. So they talk about sort of Gabe and Cole talk about when he can stop using nitrogen fertilizer. He doesn't have to keep buying the beers for Gabe. But one of the things is that Gabe's not using pasture cropping, which has that perennial grass component. So, that's a multi-stage process to get that cover crop in. So, overgraze, frosted and dormant, desiccant herbicide to knock them about, knife points and nitrogen fertilizer. So so it's a suite of practices to get that to work. So you could pasture crop in here, but you'd have to reduce the competition of those C4 grasses. So you could put cereals into that. But you've got to do that other work. During COVID, I had to move out to the Gympie Shire so I could still travel. So I always thought it was funny. I could fly, as long as I was living out in the Gympie Shire, I could drive to Brisbane and fly to Hobart and work in Tasmania. So, Lucy and I were camping out at Imbil, out in the Gympie Shire, and in the Imbil showgrounds. So it's very interesting looking at the competition of the C4 grasses and stuff. But this is lovegrass, where people drove a lot. This is lovegrass, where they drove less. And then over here, where people just camped, this is this photo here. Over here, there was none. So this photo is linked to that area there, and this photo is to the back up here. So in Queensland, there's lots of lovegrass, African lovegrass everywhere, but a lot of it's being controlled by the competition from those summer grasses. So what does that mean in terms of designing a trial? It means that somewhere along the line, I think if we're going to have low-cost, long-term control, that we need to be thinking about how are we going to get some of these competition back into the pastures, and how we're going to get those healthy things going so that you've actually able to do this long term at low cost, and it's not relying on herbicide. I'll just go on to another one. This is just work I did down in Tasmania on serrated tussock. Serrated tussock's much easier than African lovegrass, I found, because what you're doing is, so down there, cocksfoot grows readily. So this area was solid serrated tussock with no evidence of any other plants. It was sort of, the way it was managed was set stocked. And what happens is that you get a few serrated tussock. It's not very palatable when it's not green and growing. And then you get this low protein, low energy, high fiber material, same as African lovegrass and a few of the others. Excuse me, that then, you know, it just starts to just take over. And when we were looking at this, it was solid serrated tussock. So what we did was some trials, and so just using trampling. So there was incredible volume of litter in between the serrated tussock, but it was floating. It hadn't been pushed onto the soil surface using high stock density. So when we trampled it, we didn't eat the serrated tussock. The idea was just to use the animals to push it down. So the focus wasn't on eating. The focus was on changing the soil, the way the land was functioning between the serrated tussock. So managing the inter-tussock space until we could germinate something in there. So as soon as we trampled it, you germinated cocksfoot. And so then you'd let that recover, a long recovery, and then come back through and do it again. And you know, they've got more to eat the next time because they've got this cocksfoot. So you just pulse it back. And what happens is as you pulse it back, the cocksfoot takes over more and more of the pasture. So with set stocking and too shorter recoveries for the perennial grasses, the better perennials, the serrated tussock moves in, you change that relationship, the serrated tussock moves out. That's the lowest cost, lowest risk, long-term solution to a lot of these weeds and plants. So when you're designing the trials, I keep using, you know, the sort of Dave Snowden stuff is that any trial, you know, can be done. So you're doing these are only small trials. This one down here was a bit bigger than I'd normally do. I'd normally only do the area that those animals are standing in. So just a very small part of the paddock. And then anything that's got any chance of success. So like, you know, if it's African lovegrass and you know you need C4 competition, I'd try the African subtropicals and see if you can get them to germinate and establish and start doing this pushing out the weed. I'd be doing grazing trials at ultra high stock density and long recoveries so that you get information back and, you know, does that work at all? Does it not? So, you know, because there's usually a lot of conflict in this area. So where we have these complex situations of weeds and money and people and stuff, that's where conflict lives. So the way to solve that conflict problem is just to quickly go, okay, you come up with the safe to fail trial. So if someone says, I want to try compost tea, you just say, great, you design it. What are you going to measure? Or what are you going to observe? What do you think you will see? So, you know, if it's a weed, you're going to say, well, you know, usually it's less weed, more landscape function. It would be the target. So does the compost tea create those conditions? But the person that comes up with the idea is responsible for designing the trial and determining what's going to be measured and then implementing it. Because that's sort of the way of getting ownership in them doing that. So it reduces conflict because everyone's allowed to have an idea and stuff, and no one says, oh, I don't think so. It could work. So you just go ahead and do it. And that reduces this problem. This one up here is really interesting. This is sort of on this side, the guy sprays and, you know, set stocks and that, but he has only the lovegrass sort of just sticking out through the fence. So, but yeah, it's costing him a fortune to maintain these conditions. It's sort of, this land sort of near the flight path into the Hobart aerodrome, sort of airport, sorry. Yeah, so this is sort of on that path in there. So it's on that east side of the airport. That was about all I had, Dan. Was any other comments or questions come through, or anyone want to jump in?
I did forget to mention at the start, yeah, if there was any questions, you can fire them through. We've still got 4 minutes till the top of the hour. Has anyone got any questions for Graeme? If you do, type them into the Q&A section down the bottom. Anything else you'd like to discuss in the meantime, Graeme?
Yeah, I'll just go on. I just thought it might have been a good spot to stop, but happy to take any questions at any time. So what I've been trying to do here is just sort of outline some of that design thinking for the safe to fail trials and looking at, you know, where could the plant be, but it's not, and trying to work out, well, how do I get that long-term weed control, and also cover a lot of those. I still doing, let me get back onto this page. Oh, it doesn't want to do it. Click, click. I'm still getting, a lot of times I'm having to explain, you know, so what are those grazing things and how do they interact with the soil surface? So if you wanted to use grazing to regenerate perennial grasses on your property, how would you do it? So we've done this on most areas. It can be a bit too slow for people, but it's a really good skill to have. How do I take bare ground and manage it so that it goes back to perennial grass? How do I use the animals and the soil seed bank so that I can get it back to perennial grass? So recovery is crucial. It impacts all of these things. You know, it grows annuals, it increases the bases and allows time for establishment of the perennial grasses. It grows litter. It increases, you know, people would have heard of probably Johnson Sioux, that a lot of their work is done for the Johnson Sioux compost. What would you call it? It's static aerated compost. That the complexity and the fungal content and the diversity of the compost increases dramatically over that 9-12 months. So, and it's the same, appears to be the same for the litter between the plants, that you need that long recovery. And recovery lets those basal cover of the grasses, the bases grow higher so that you get some of that surface roughness. So really crucial, poorly understood. Not growing litter is usually the biggest thing. If you are managing a grassland that's got really good litter cover and decomposing litter, and you start to change your management, or the season changes or something happens, then the first thing you usually lose is that composting of the litter or the decomposing of the litter. So what happens is you lose the decomposing of the litter, then you tend to lose the litter, then you'll lose the grasses on that way down. So the early warning indicator is always to look at the decomposition of the litter. Stock density, like stock density promotes germination. So it promotes germination through the hoof action at high stock density. You get this threshold below which you'll germinate usually annuals and forbs, above which you'll germinate grasses, perennial grasses. So stock density, and I think it's to do with the hoof action. I hope that's okay to say, because it's really hard to find the research, but it seems that that twisting and that change in animal behavior when they're milling at that high stock density either gives soil to seed contact or scarifies and promotes the germination of perennial grasses. And it's usually quite a a high stock density. So require, lets annuals grow, promotes the the perennial grasses, and it increases that decomposition of the litter. So if you've got litter in the paddock and it's not decomposing, it needs to be pushed onto the soil surface. And the lowest cost, lowest risk, most profitable thing to do is usually to use animals for that. So I need to be really clear. I'm talking about an area of agriculture that is low cost, low risk, and moderately consistently profitable. So over a decade, you've got more money in the bank than what you started the decade with. So that's the target market that I focus on, because that seems to be that consistent for people's well-being and profit in the bank. That's the word to focus on. And plant utilization. That's probably the highest conflict in the grazing trainers. So 9 out of 10, not dentists, 9 out of 10 grazing trainers would say that you only eat the top half of the plant. I'm arguing that that's wrong. So I need to be really clear, because some people think I'm sitting on the fence. I go, wow, I didn't feel like I was. I'm arguing that that's wrong, and you lose the better perennial grasses. And Andre Voisin, in his book, Grass Productivity, says it doesn't work, which is also the book that most people quote. So I need to be really clear. There's 2 types of plant utilization. You're focusing on leaf-driven recovery, and they're drawing heavily on the Frank Kreider USDA research, and there's root-driven recovery, and there's only a few of us talking about this root-driven recovery with high utilization. So in total, that's the relationships, and that's the links. So this is like death by PowerPoint. I think it's very exciting, but not everyone agrees with me. That if you want to build landscape function and biodiversity, you've got to change the soil surface, which means that you've got to manage and solve that combination of recovery, stock density, and utilization. And if you have long recoveries, you need high utilization and stock density to cycle everything. Otherwise, you'll get too much carbon and not enough nitrogen. How was that there?
Sorry, I'll just unmute myself. No, I think that's really good. Thanks, Graeme. Another interesting webinar again today, learning lots from a cropping perspective on my end. So
yeah, oh, good.
Really interesting, that last sort of comment about the composting side of things. And that's sort of one thing in our cropping system. We're strip and disc, and that's what we want to do, is we want to grow our compost and leave it there, and whether you're in a grazing system or whether cropping system like ours, we still want that litter on the ground and that composting effect. And we start to see, once we do get that in full ground cover, then we do start to see some improvements, especially in that top inch that you're talking about, that really matters. So you get the microbes all working together, and our livestock, which are our termites and worms and all that sort of stuff, doing their job in that topsoil. So thank you very much, Graeme, for your time today. Big thank you to the CMA and the Australian Government's National Landcare Program for your support. Couple of things before we wrap up. Next week, next Thursday, 7 a.m. Is our next webinar with Graeme. That'll be the 5th of 6. So we've got 2 to go. And this one is being recorded and will be up on YouTube to look at later on today. We will have a survey at the end, so if you could kindly fill that out for us, that would be great. And that's about it from me. Thank you very much again, Graeme, and look forward to seeing everyone next week.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Graeme. Bye.
Bye.